So I'm John Draper, Program Director for Research and Partnerships at the Stem Cell Network, and I'd like to welcome you back to Stem Cells from the Sofa for a special episode which addresses the experience and impacts of our community that they've experienced during the pandemic. It's been a long and difficult year for many, and we have experienced many different stresses. The pandemic has had far-reaching impacts on work life and home life, and at this point, we still have a considerable way to go before anything approaching normality returns. But as we pass a year since the pandemic was declared, it feels appropriate to reflect on what we've experienced and share strategies for managing challenges, identifying new opportunities, and begin to plan, hopefully, for a better future as well. So today, I'm very fortunate to be joined by 4 researchers who span the gamut of research career stages and who will describe the impacts they have witnessed and share strategies that they have used to cope with the unprecedented interruptions and challenges that the pandemic has brought. Our speakers will also reflect on big picture impacts and discuss actions that our community can consider as we attempt to address the challenges and imbalances that will reverberate for some time to come. Our speakers will touch on issues relating to wellness and mental health, and I should let you know that we have a second webinar focused on mental health in academia, which we're co-hosting with our good friends and partners at BioCanRx. And this is scheduled for 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, April 21st, and should be considered essential viewing for all researchers, and not only those dealing with issues or supporting others who are experiencing difficulties. More info on this and other training events will be shared at the end, so do hang on till that point. I'd like to remind you all that this is an interactive session, so please use the Q&A feature to pose questions to the speakers. You can do this at any point, and I will gather those questions and provide them to the speakers at a later point in the session as well. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers today. And as I said, we have a range of career stages. So I'll start with Marissa Lithopoulos, who is a trainee. Marissa conducted her PhD studies in Dr. Bernard Thabot's lab at the Ottawa Hospital. And she will defend her thesis in April, quite soon. She is excited to transition to a postdoctoral fellow in Dr. Freda Miller's lab at UBC. And Marissa is also interested in the bioethical research and was a teaching assistant at the University of Ottawa Philosophy Department during her grad studies. Also joining us is Dr. Zachary Laksman. Zachary is a cardiac electrophysiologist who specializes in the management of heart rhythm disorders, including heart rhythm surgeries and devices. He is a clinician-scientist with a specific focus on stem cell disease modeling, drug screening, cardiogenetics, and personalized medicine. As an early career principal investigator at the Centre for Heart-Lung Regeneration at St. Paul's Hospital, Dr. Laksman is the inaugural Dr. Charles Kerr Distinguished Scholar in Cardiovascular Genetics and holds a Health Professional Investigator Award from the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. Dr. Kristen Hope also joins us. Kristen began her independent research career as an assistant professor at McMaster University in 2010 and was recruited in 2020 by the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre at the University Health Network, where she is a senior scientist and holds an associate professorship in the Department of Medical Biophysics at the University of Toronto. Kristen also holds an Ontario Institute for Cancer Research Investigator Award and is a Medicine by Design investigator. Her research focuses on understanding the molecular control of stemness in the blood system in both normal and disease states, with the goal of identifying novel stem cell regulators that could form the basis of therapeutic agents in the future. And then Dr. Jim Woodgett also joins us. As you know, Jim joined us for our first Stem Cells from the Sofa, looking at pandemic impacts and how to deal with them. Jim is a senior scientist and until recently was the director of research at the Lunenfeld-Tanenbaum Research Institute. Jim runs a lab that focuses on how signal transduction regulates everything we think and do and write, including this short bio, as he wrote. He gained his PhD and trained at the Salk Institute with Tony Hunter before starting a lab in London, UK. He moved to Canada and the Princess Margaret Hospital and has been at the Lunenfeld-Tanenbaum Research Institute for the past 16 years. Jim continues to play numerous leadership roles in the Canadian health research environment, including membership of the Medical Advisory Board of the Gardner Foundation and his election as Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Jim is also a prolific Twitter user and has used the platform to champion the cause of early career scientists and equity in science careers. So with that, I will now turn, and I think we'll take it in career stage order here, and we're going to hear some reflections, some observations that each of the researchers have witnessed. And so Marissa, can we start with you, please? And could you share your experiences and insights as a trainee over the last year of extraordinary events?
Thanks, John. So 2020, going into it, was supposed to be this big, exciting year. It was going to be the final year of my PhD. I needed to write my thesis, write several papers, and find my post-doctoral fellowship position. And unfortunately, like a lot of trainees, that was sort of derailed, and there was way more stress that was added to an already stressful year. And I was very fortunate that early on in 2020, I had accepted my postdoctoral fellowship position in Dr. Freda Miller and Dr. David Kaplan's lab, and I was really looking forward to making this transition. So I had sort of this beacon of hope, this light at the end of the tunnel to look forward to and to help motivate me throughout 2020. I'm also the type of person that needs to set a very specific goal and keep to that goal, and that really helps me stay focused. And so I had the date of when I wanted to submit my thesis, and I kept with that date no matter what. That was going to be when I submitted my thesis. And it was really challenging to do. And I know a lot of trainees were unable to sort of keep on with the dates that they wanted to submit certain academic deadlines and papers for. And I just want to say that it's okay. And I hope our field is compassionate and forgiving in this sense and does not penalize anyone who did not meet certain deadlines, because 2020 was this crazy, unpredictable year, and we shouldn't be penalizing people for that. We all have very different experiences. I think for trainees, physically not being able to go into the lab was a huge stressor. We weren't able to do our wet lab work. And so we had to turn elsewhere to be productive. A lot of us wrote, whether it's reviews, whether it's our thesis. And we also turned to computational biology a lot more, and perhaps looking at what's already online and published for data sets that we could analyze. So I think that was a big transition. And I also personally was affected because I was living alone, and I found it to be a very isolating experience last year, not being able to meet with friends and family, not being able to meet with colleagues. And just a little bit of background on myself, I was born and raised in Ottawa, and I'm now 28. So 28 years of my life, very deep roots in that city. And I also was raised in Dr. Thibault's lab. I met him when I was 19. And so very formative years of my life were spent in that lab, and to not be able to see my colleagues that I used to see every day. And also, this was a big transitional period of my life, which is very stressful. I was moving cities, and as I said, have always lived in the same city. So that was huge in and of itself. So to move in a pandemic was this other huge stressor. And then I didn't have those rituals that we normally have to make that goodbye transition, right? So I didn't get to give hugs to my family and friends before I left Ottawa. And so that was also a very big loss in my life. And I know for a lot of trainees, not just those who are living alone, but it's just difficult to not be able to see your friends and family. And it can be very isolating. And for me to get through that, it was really leaning on my support systems, reaching out, letting people know that, listen, I'm struggling here. I'm not going to be as productive as I want to be. And I hope that you have a supervisor or other people in your lab that you can lean on and get help from. And if not, then it's really important that you reach elsewhere. I know there are a lot of great PIs in Canada that are mentors to trainees that are not within their own labs. And if you're somehow feeling intimidated that you don't want to reach out, there's older trainees like myself that would be happy to help make those connections for you. So I think that's really important. And I think moving forward, what we need to focus on in academia is helping trainees with a better work-life balance. So it's a bit healthier. I know personally for myself in 2020, I leaned more towards the work. And that's really difficult to do, especially when you're not seeing your family and friends. That can take a big toll on mental health and physical health. And I also would like to see our field more target networking, because we don't have those organic meetings with each other anymore. And so we really need to help our trainees make those connections so that we can further our career and also collaborate with one another and make better science as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Marissa. That's really, really helpful to share all of those insights that you've had there. So you can ask questions at any point, and you can do that through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And next up, we're going to hear from Zachary. So as an early career, as a career clinical scientist, you've experienced different challenges, Zach. So do you think you'd be able to share those with us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for those of you who are clinicians or who work with clinicians, you'll readily know that there were unique challenges providing ongoing care to patients when you can't see patients. We've all become, as clinicians, administrators to some degree or another, really with the hospital and our patients relying on us to change the way that we provide care. And it's certainly taken our focus away from research from time to time. And, you know, I can tell you, when you're in the middle of a hospital outbreak, you're getting COVID swabbed every day, waiting for your result to tell you whether or not you should go home and isolate for 2 weeks or not. It's certainly hard to shift gears mentally and get back to that paper or grant that you should be writing. But I think we've all experienced that anxiety in different ways. I think, and you know, for myself, the lab closure, as well as Marissa already mentioned, was very stressful. For the way that we dealt with it was the first thing that I typically do when you're in a period of great change is do an asset survey. So what's the infrastructure that's available locally? And I was very fortunate that we had connections to a large biobank and tissue registry, but also, as Marissa mentioned, now this asset survey includes international resources and data sets. And so we really looked outwards to see where we could access data, what we could work with, and what we could learn from. We had to upskill tremendously, and we're still in the process of that, of using computational biology and understanding you know, different tools that are available, anything from machine learning to deep learning. And this is where I've really relied on the students in the lab who are interested, and maybe their minds are more agile than mine, to upskill, but also to reach out and connect. And I wanted to also focus on that, because networking is a different beast altogether. It's very effort dependent. It uses different tools. And even though I'm an early career investigator, you know, I did over 12 years of clinical training. So I'm sort of in a mid-life stage, and social media is not something that I was readily accessing, but I really relied on a new postdoctoral fellow in our lab, Layli Rohani, who has been mentoring me and coaching me in how to network online and using social media. And it's been amazing. We've connected with labs all over the world who are really interested in helping us and teaching us these different skill sets. The last thing I just wanted to focus on briefly was being an early career investigator. You know, that is a time in everyone's life that's full of uncertainty. You're more worried about perception than you probably were before, because you want to assert yourself and demonstrate productivity, and doing that in the middle of a pandemic is certainly challenging. And what I wanted to emphasize is you really, as an early career researcher, understand what mentorship is from an administrative standpoint, because you're looking to those superiors, those senior investigators or senior clinicians in your department to really not only steer you in the right direction, but also support you through this. And so when you are looking for positions at any stage in your career, I think understanding who those key people are in your institution and in the administration to go to and rely on is really critical.
Thanks, Zach. That's great. So next up, Kristen, you're an established mid-career researcher who moved both institutions and home during the pandemic, whilst also juggling family life, as others as well would be. So could you share some of the challenges that you've witnessed and perhaps some of the strategies you've developed as well?
Sure. Yeah, so again, as you've mentioned, John, I'm a mid-career investigator, so I have slightly different challenges that we've undergone last year in comparison to the early career investigators. And that I sort of have an established group and we have the inertia and we have to keep that going. And I have 9 lab members. So, you know, I was very cognizant of the fact that those 9 individuals needed my support and help, even, you know, in the background of me being, my bandwidth being significantly compromised because of all the things that you've just mentioned, John. So what I found very challenging was ensuring that I had the time and that I made the time to check in with the students, both just to see how they're doing, but also to track their progress and to help them plan. So I found that to be something that was very difficult, but something that was so important to keep up. You know, I think it's also difficult because in the past, you know, those interactions would be so, you know, you walk in the lab or the office and you encounter 2-3 people and you can have those conversations informally. And so it really takes a real conscious effort in this environment to reach out and connect with those trainees and students. But it's so important. And it goes both ways. They're incredibly supportive of me. And I think that is a really important point, is mentorship goes both ways. As you've mentioned, I'm a parent. So I have 2 young kids in primary school. And and I have a spouse that works very long hours as well. So, you know, we've been really juggling the online schooling that's been necessary during the school closures and trying to balance the shepherding of the kids' learning while also doing all of the other jobs and tasks that a PI needs to be doing. So certainly my ability to write papers and grants and to think deeply about science, which I think is so critical, again, was really compromised last year. And this is where I did reach out to the lab and I asked, you know, if you guys are able, if you're in a space where you're able to help me with these things, I would love your help. So that a lot more of that happened this year, which I actually think was really good. I hope the trainees would agree that this actually was a great learning experience for them, and it gave them some independence in tasks that they might not otherwise have been as involved in. And I've really valued those interactions a lot. So I definitely have shared the load. That's one of the themes that I think I will share with all of you. And it's been very helpful. I think if I had tried to go it alone and, you know, take this sort of stiff upper lip mentality, it would have been a lot harder. And I think to that point, I've really tried to think about how I think about my own expectations of myself, and very consciously to give myself a break. There's only so much that one person can do, and you have to give yourself that break. And furthermore, I think you have to advocate for yourself to those that are evaluating you, and tell them these challenges, you know, within reason, of course, because sharing that challenge has also been an extremely positive experience for me. And I've definitely gotten support and deadlines extended and flexibility given. So I think that's something that the pandemic has actually possibly done for us, is it's put out there this idea that it's okay to share those challenges, and that a lot of us and many of us have gone through different challenges, and that those need to be brought to light and considered, and some flexibility given in, on tenure and promotion boards, at the grant panels, those sorts of things. So, I think that my theme that I would want to impart to really anyone is really share the load, put yourself out there, make these connections. It is hard, it does require a conscious effort, but as Zach was saying, one of the things we've done is try to reach out, solidify existing collaborations, keep them going, fire them up more than they've already been, and reach out to others whose work we think is cool, who we might want to partner with. And those have also been extremely exciting interactions this year that have kept the fire alive and kept the excitement going. So I think I'll end it there, but I'm happy to answer questions that anyone might have.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kristen. So Jim, you're up next. So as a senior researcher, you've got your finger on the pulse of Canadian health research environment. And it would be great if you could describe some of the sort of higher level opportunities and challenges that you've observed in this whole situation.
Yeah, I've got my pulse on the finger, John. I got to say, when we first did this a year ago, sitting on this lumpy sofa, which is still lumpy, I really hadn't thought we'd be sitting here a year into this, and actually not really having a particularly good idea of the exit strategy. Well, we know what the exit strategy is, we just don't know the timetable. And I'm not going to dwell on that, because I think the title of this is what is it?
An optimist
guide, right, to overcoming pandemic impacts. And I think we're surrounded with doom and gloom, and that's not to to belittle the huge negative impacts the pandemic's had. I just don't think we need to reiterate those. We live those. So yeah, in terms of, I think it's been really interesting listening to the impact that the pandemic's had on researchers at different career stages. And I think it's also true that all of our experiences are different, just because our environments are different, and our own local networks are very different, and our institutions are different. So what I'm interested in, I think, and again, I'll try and spin this in an optimistic way, is asking the question as to are our institutions and our funders and science in general going to be perceived in a different way going forward? And I think there's some evidence for that. I'm probably a little bit more cynical about the impact it's going to have, for example, on funding through the government, because although they've said science drives everything, and I think it's very true that science is illuminating the path out of this, it's also true that we're going to enter a period of relative austerity, and there's going to be challenges. I think as well, we have to remember that the support environment is going to be quite chaotic. We have in this area of stem cell research, we're fortunate. We have a lot of charitable funding, and the charities have been suffering enormously. Some have had to cut back their funding. Some have had to cut back their own staff. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and the recovery phase is going to be challenging. I think, though, and the three previous speakers sort of talked about this or touched upon this. We have to remember that actually everybody's experiencing the pandemic, and so I'm a little bit less concerned of the recognition of the impacts. And as Kristen said, you actually should be talking about this, because if somebody else isn't talking about it, it's because they probably think that you don't want to hear about it. But in fact, sharing that information, sharing and empathizing is really not a part of the healing process, but actually the coping process. And we do tend to keep things in. And I think it also helps to normalize it, because for sure, there are groups, there are scientists, there are labs who have been more affected than others. There are some who have done, probably done even better with the pandemic than without it, because just, that's the way science is. And so I think that, the challenge is not going to be that people don't understand what the past year has done. And I think it will be taken into account. And I know trainees in particular see this as a lost year. And you shouldn't look upon it in that way, because as, again, other people have mentioned, you've actually generated different levels of coping with independence, and finding solutions to problems which, again, weren't you're making. So it's not a lost year by any means. I think we've coped relatively well. I also think, that moving forward, we talked about the importance of networking, and that's really been the major loss, I would say, aside from just the personal interactions that we all thrive upon in laboratories and in research groups, and that's where organizations like the Stem Cell Network really can and should step up to the plate. And this is one example of having to network. But I saw there was an announcement earlier this week that the American Association of Cell Biology, American Society for Cell Biology, which runs a huge annual conference every year. So it's towards the end of the year. It's in December of this year. That's going to be a virtual conference, and they have normally would have 15,000 people attend that conference, right? So it's going to be virtual. So this is not going to go away, and I think we have to make sure that we don't actually drop back in, as what he's saying. Don't keep wearing masks after you get vaccinated and all that sort of stuff. We've got to maintain the extra effort in communicating and working with others, because it is going to be a longer period of time. And I think, psychologically, you think about a year is a hell of a long time, but 2 years, now you're starting to really look into the chunk of your career span. And it's so we cannot just dismiss that. It's the next year is going to be incredibly important to regroup and to regain momentum. But again, I wouldn't worry about people dismissing and thinking, oh, there's a hole in your CV. There's a hole in absolutely everybody's CVs, and we understand that.
Thanks, Jim. That's great. So we've got some questions coming in, and please do take the time, and if you feel that you've heard something that you agree with, or you've got suggestions, or just curious about something, to just use the Q&A function to add a question to the growing list that we've got here. So I'm going to start with some of the points that were raised and address some of these questions as well. So Marissa, you talked about your experience as a trainee, and I know that both Zach, Jim, and Kristen all have trainees who they're working with as well. And so maybe you can reflect upon how it's been different for different stages of trainees, this experience, and what are the impacts that they've actually seen from their perspective.
Yeah, it's a really important question, because it is very different depending on if you're just starting your graduate studies, if you're sort of midway, if you're right at the end, or a postdoc, a very different experience. So I'll start with early on, and even undergraduate students that are sort of considering going into research. I think for them, they might be looking at the academic field and think of it as very daunting. There's certain things that academia already has problems with that I think need to be improved, such as compensation for the work that we do. I think those are really big topics of conversation that trainees are having right now. And I totally understand if you're an undergraduate student or, in your master's, maybe you have a family and you're thinking, could I actually study and do research and support myself, my family? And I don't know in certain cases if you could right now in academia. And so that's a really scary thought, that we're losing really bright minds because we're just not supporting our trainees well. And with the pandemic on top of that, as Jim was saying, we're sort of going to enter into a period where there's less funding because we've devoted a lot of funding towards COVID research. And so the question then becomes, how are we going to compensate those trainees? So I think really early on, people might be wondering, is this the career path for me? And they might be looking at other areas, industry, government, that might compensate them better. And that's really where it's a personal choice, but also talk to people that are currently in academia, talk to the older graduate students, the postdocs and PIs. Don't be scared to talk to PIs because they've been through a lot and they have really important stories to tell and share. And even though now they have really nice bios and, you know, you see them smiling on their websites, like they have gone through a lot to get to where they are today, and they can help you through those struggles. So don't be afraid to talk to your PI, and it doesn't make you seem weak or anything like that. It's actually very strong to be vulnerable and share that you're worried about this. So that's my advice to those young trainees. Really seek out those mentors, and hopefully as more mature trainees and PIs, we also try to give back and try to mentor as best as we can. And if you're in sort of that mid-trainee stage, I think that's a really exciting time because you have sort of a little bit of leeway in your project to explore a bit more with experiments. You're not on as tight of a schedule, and you really have the opportunity to explore, what do you want to do? And you might have already made connections with PIs that you're admiring, that you might want to go work for. You might have made those connections if you're at a conference with people from industry. And so you have probably those business cards and those connections right now. So now take the time to really reach out and do your homework, I would say, because we're not meeting in person organically right now. So it's really up to you to email them, schedule a video chat. You'll be surprised. A lot of people are very willing to help you out. And so I think take that shot, and don't be afraid if you don't get an email back. People are very busy. Email them again if you're really eager to hear what they have to say. And a lot of people do want to help you out. Sometimes it's not, I work in your lab, but it's, I really admire the work that you do. How did you get to that position? And a lot of people will be very eager to give you that advice. And I think for later stage trainees, well, that's where you're kind of really making that decision. Do you want to stay in academia? Which lab do you want to be in? Or do you start your own lab? And how do you get over that hurdle, which of course is a whole other challenge. And we could have an hour talk on that as well. And I think you really have to dig deep and decide for yourself, is this the path that I want to take? Because right now there are a lot of challenges. And again, I would say you're never too old to talk to mentors and to discuss those challenges with people. It's always going to be helpful. And you have to decide, is it worth taking those hurdles for? And if you're very passionate about the work that you're doing, I think it really is worth it in the end. So I would say my message is one of positivity. Stick with it, even though this is a really rough time, if this is what you want to do and you know you want to do it. And I think we have the people in Canada to really make a difference and make academia more of a healthy culture, and we can do it together. So I think if you're in the later career stage, you know, don't give up hope, even though sometimes it seems, as Jim was saying, this was a lost year, because actually, like, we have very great minds right now and we can make positive changes in academia.
I like those points. I particularly like the point of discussing things and normalizing the struggle so that others feel that they are empowered to be able to actually discuss this as well with their peers and their supervisors. You also, I mean, you touched on something else, which maybe I'll ask you, Zach. Trainee recruitment, you touched on this. This has been impacted, and from your perspective, you know, what can trainees do to try and deal with some of the issues that have been raised? I mean, this goes all the way from undergraduate students who no longer have the opportunity to do lab placements, which was a major recruitment pool for investigators, all the way through to people who are hoping to transit from you know, one subject to another. They've developed a skill set and they think they've identified where they want to go in life. So what do you think there?
Yeah, so I think it's a major problem, and it's a problem for supervisors and students alike. You know, the culture of science that I've always really enjoyed is the community aspect. And, you know, different than the clinical side and clinical conferences, the approachability of really high-level senior investigators that internationally has, you know, they've always been really accessible, even to very junior people, whereas in the clinical side, you don't see that level of, it's much more hierarchical. So the loss of those interpersonal connections has challenged people in different ways. And I think the more, from my experience, the more junior people, there's a lot more variability, because people who have survived in the system have survived because they're good. They figure out ways of connecting and networking and communicating. And people who are junior, they have their own personal attributes, which sometimes are better interpersonally. Sometimes it takes them time to warm up to a group. And without those opportunities, they don't have the experience to really leverage to try different things. So some have really excelled and some have become more isolated. And so recognizing that and trying to help identify people that need the extra assistance or mentorship or role modeling is really a challenge. The other thing that I think is really tough is for students to know that they fit into a group. Because one thing I've really always, one thing I learned from Gordon Keller is whenever he took a student on, from even international students, they would spend a week or 2 weeks in the lab just getting to know people, because those relationships are relationships you're going to be married to for 2 to 5 to 7 years. And you want to know what the culture of the lab is and make sure that it's a culture that you like working in and that you feel you'll excel in. And so those things aren't really tangible anymore. And, you know, I'm still struggling to try to figure out ways to not only show what our lab culture is and our communication, but actually continue to improve it, because that feedback is really something that's lacking.
That's good. Some really good insights there. Thank you. And I'm just going to stay with you a little bit longer as well, because as an ECR, you've experienced you know, some unique challenges, I think, and so maybe you can articulate some of the areas which have particularly affected ECRs in this whole issue, and if there's any optimistic sort of suggestions for a resolution of these issues, then please let us know.
I think, you know, for me, one of the biggest challenges is that we are in a building phase, and we're hoping to be in a rapid building phase. You know, if you've tried to order pipettes in the last few months, you know that nothing happens quickly. Global supply lines are down. Technical support from company representatives is challenging. We're not able to do demos on equipment that we would like. So, you know, we are in a constant sense of anxiety about when is our next shipment coming for this next piece of equipment so that we can then move on. And I think we've all struggled from that in some way or another, but for people really building infrastructure from the ground up, I think it's been the most challenging. I think, you know, in terms of how can I spin that into a positive, you know, I would go back to being forced to pivot and really upskill in ways that you weren't expecting to has really opened up a lot of opportunities. You know, when I heard the word synthetic biology a year ago, I would have had to Google it. Now I still don't understand it, but at least I'm facile with some of the papers, the techniques, and I see the opportunities. And so without being forced to do this, I would have really pursued all of my objectives from my recent grants to the T and tried to nail down each one of them. And I think I probably would have been 3 or 5 years from now behind, because I didn't see what else was happening in other fields. I was so focused on really as I said, kind of setting up the lab that I thought I was supposed to and meeting the objectives that I had previously stated. So in some ways, I think 3 to 5 years from now, if I can coalesce what I'm seeing in other fields with what I was hoping to do in my own field, I think I could be ahead.
And I really like the suggestion that you made earlier about doing an asset scan, and assets can be all sorts of resources, both human resources and physical resources, as well as institutional resources. And so that's a great idea as well. So we've had a number of questions here about networking, and I'll turn to you next, Kristen, to address some of these potentially. So we have 2 questions that touch on networking from the audience. And how do you envisage the future of networking in a post-COVID research society? More importantly, what can be done better to enable and encourage the networking process?
So I think as we're sort of transiting still through a year, well, maybe not a year, 6 months or more of this continued virtual sort of interactions with people. There's an approach that we take for that period. And then I think we're all hopeful that we'll be back sort of into in-person next year. And I think maybe the approaches can all be kept, but there's additional ways we can enforce those, networking opportunities in person, like walking down the hall to talk to someone whose office is next to you, that sort of thing. But for the next, several months, 6 months or so, I think, it was funny that Zach had mentioned that he's not been he's not been up on the social media so much. I mean, this is something that I've tried really also to embrace, because it's just incredible the things that you can stumble on if you're sort of plugged in. So although I don't tweet often, I am on Twitter, and this is my go-to way to identify cool new research that's not maybe in my direct field of view, but is maybe a little peripheral, but where there's interesting techniques we could bring into our own work. So I've used that as a tool, and we've actually reached out to a couple of people through that forum and made some new connections. So I found that to be a really valuable resource. And I think the other thing is that, so I'm fortunate to have existing collaborations, which I think could have faltered or just sort of been on life support for the past year. And instead, I really tried to use those collaborations to assist training my own students in different ways this year. So we've matched up bioinformaticians in collaborating labs with students in my own group to try and bring in some of those skills and have the informatics people working with my wet lab students. So there's probably ways to turn your collaborations on their head a little bit and use the connection that you already have in some particular project with that PI, and ask about, is there anyone else in the lab that can assist us on this, element of project Y that we're doing over here. So I think, and then the other thing is to sort of use the existing networks to build new networks. So I've definitely also reached out to existing friends and collaborators, and we're interested in this area. Can you link us up with so-and-so with an introductory email? Those have also been very, very helpful ways of bringing new collaborative partnerships into play. It's a little harder as a new PI, I think, because you're sort of just building those networks. And I think Marissa's earlier point about sort of going to the more senior individuals and asking for help and introductions there is absolutely a way to go. So I've also done this, spoken to individuals or my senior mentors and asked, can you connect me with so-and-so? So there's different ways to do this. But, definitely, I don't think you can sit back and expect that people are going to come to you. You really do have to do that conscious effort of reaching out.
And I think it's been mentioned several times by several of you that it's a two-way street. Networking and mentorship is a two-way street. You can't just sit there and expect, everybody to shower love and praise on you and help. You've got to be able to come to the table with something that you can offer as well. And that's going to vary, obviously, depending upon your stage of career. But so, Jim, do you have anything else to add to the networking component?
Kristen made a good point actually about things like social media. I mean, it can be a time sink as well, but you develop a you can develop a sort of a level of rigor, just in the same way that, you know, if you think about your strategies for learning about developments in your field and which papers or which journals you might want to look at, you can do the same with things like Twitter and Facebook. I don't use Facebook, but if you apply those filters, then they can be incredibly powerful. And the other thing about it is that, you know, it's just in the same way that, you know, when you used to walk down the corridor and grab a coffee and you talk about science, but you'd also talk about other stuff. That's what it is. You find that interjected. So, you know, there are some really good discussions. Really, they're like water cooler discussions, for want of a better term, in social media, which you know can sort of bring you back into thinking outside of your box, outside of your maybe anxiety level, you know, and recognize that other people are experiencing this. And I think Marissa mentioned, you know, things like loneliness and isolation are really can be quite devastating, because you tend to internalize, and so that the way out of that is actually to do the exact opposite, which is then to reach out, and it's very, very difficult. So I'd say as well, you know, if there are members of your group in your lab, don't assume that other people are taking care of them or interacting with them. You know, reach out, because in fact it's easier to do that over things like Zoom and FaceTime or whatever than in the lab sometimes, because you can set it up, and you can you know, you don't have to define it, and it's not you know, there shouldn't be other aspects or worries at the same time. So, you know, things like you know, how long you've been in the lab, or the number of people somebody else knows, that all gets washed away. And I would really encourage people to be ensuring that, you know, their own group is doing well as, you know, your neighboring labs. And it's, again, it just extends knowledge. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, which is, you know, I think, because I noticed in a couple of other questions about the emphasis on early career investigators and trainees, not surprisingly, you know, I think there's, when I mentioned about austerity and lack of funding, there's a real concern, or I at least have a real concern about a potential generational loss. And I don't really mean about the people who are in the system right now, but I do care about those people. But also, you know, if we're seen as a you know, not taking care of the people who have trained and ensured that, you know, that they recover from the past year or so, it's going to send an awfully bad signal to people considering going into science and research. So I think it's incumbent upon the funders and the institutions to actually ensure that we recover from this as quickly as possible, and in part that's because of the amount of time it's taken already, and the disruption it's caused. But, you know, the longer this goes on, and the longer people are looking at alternatives, the more difficult it is to actually make sure that there is consistency. And I think, you know, the last point I'd make is that, you know, we always worried about, we're focusing on academia, but it's interesting. There are so many opportunities, and there is actually a lot of venture capital funding, biotechs. They've done really well. So there are lots of potential openings for people who have got PhDs and relevant expertise. So, you know, and also in academia too, because there's a wave of retirements. You know, that's the baby boomers are finally shuttling off this mortal coil, and finally are opening up positions. So that's going to happen over the next 5 years. So there are some positive demographic aspects as well.
Okay. So you mentioned the differential impact on groups in society, including minority groups, and I'm just wondering whether any of the panelists can share insights on the additional burden, for instance, that women have faced in this particular situation. And perhaps also if you have any insights on other minority groups. I don't, Kristen or Marissa, would you like to field that one?
Sure, I mean, I can speak first if that's okay. Yeah, so I think certainly I've experienced, as a female with kids, I've experienced a lot of challenges this year. There, definitely the support systems that I had put in place through many years, to help with childcare and all manner of other things in my life. That's really all gone this year. So again, what you have to do with that is realize that you're not failing by not managing to play all these new roles you have to play to the nth degree. You're not failing. Really, it's impossible to wear all these hats and do those jobs, at an Olympic level. So give yourself a break.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to work hard at that, though, because I think many of us are very much perfectionists and we want to do well in all areas of our life. So that took some time for me to get to that point in my own headspace where I could give myself that break. And then I think, as I said before, it's important to share the challenges that we've had to undergo. And, I'm not going to have submitted those papers that I otherwise would have submitted, 6 months ago. I just haven't had the time to work on them to the level that I would like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm gonna let people know that, and I'm gonna let people know that I haven't had the bandwidth to apply to 3-4 grants. And I think Jim's right. I think that will be looked at in a very positive way. I don't think there's going to be penalizations, but I think we do still have to make those points and get that out there, that this has been a year where specific groups, specific individuals have had very unique challenges, and that, accommodation and an understanding of that, the peaks and valleys that we all go through, but especially this year, is so important. Yeah.
Science is fairly unique in such that it's a peer review system. So it's your peers often placing expectations upon you, and so they have a duty, do you think, to be a little bit easier on, be a little bit more considerate on the burdens that people have felt over the last year? Is that something that you...
I can tell you, John, that if I was on a panel right now and I saw someone's application, someone who had gone through what I've been going through, I would be very vocal about giving that person a break and potentially contextualizing for the rest of the panel a little bit of what that's like, because it is sometimes difficult to empathize and understand. So you really do have to sort of get better at explaining just how challenging, maybe with numbers, my capacity to work on my job was about 50% of what it normally would be. And so that's going to translate into 50% less grants that I could write and 50% less papers that I could put out. So I think it's really incumbent upon all of us at all levels to advocate for these individuals. And I know I will be doing this on those panels, and when I have the opportunity in those decision-making processes, I will absolutely be vocal about this.
Thank you. So on the theme of what can scientists do at all levels, are there some actions or activities or processes that scientists can actually join, take part in, advocate for, that can make some changes here? I'll open that to anyone who wants to answer that. Jim.
I think it actually is, just following up directly from what Kristen was saying. There are some people who are going to have not been affected, as I mentioned before, by the pandemic as much as others. And they're the people who also got more time. And so they're the people who don't necessarily decline sitting on a ground panel, right? So this actually makes it even worse, right? So you have so it's tough to say to someone like Kristen, well, please make sure you prioritize sitting on a ground panel, even though you're only able to run at 50%. And the alternative to that is to ensure that actually the funding agencies and the fellowship committees and the tenure track committees and what have you have representation and understanding of your situation. And but it's tricky. You can't just say, the last year has been really awful. Because you don't want to empty your heart over all of the problems that you've necessarily had to endure. But at the same time, people don't realize that. So I think that's what I mean by, I think that we have to raise the awareness, and actually, I think there's an opportunity here to change how we evaluate. And it's not quantity, it's quality. It's what impact have you had? There are multiple ways to look at impact. It fits in with all sorts of other changes which we're seeing right now. And it actually underscores some of the equity and diversity initiatives which the agencies have been bringing in, which are meant to recognize the different challenges people have, which are anti-diversity, which are actually excluding people. So, on a positive measure, it means that we have to somehow ensure that that those principles are defended, and the people who are in positions of influence are ensuring that that's taken into consideration. And I don't know really how to do that except by saying, you make it explicit in all of the adjudications that we understand that normally go forward in research. So I think there are ways to do that, but unfortunately, when I was listening to Kristen just say, it's like, how could she find time to sit on a CIHR panel, a stem cell network panel, and yet it's we have to have people who are already overburdened take that responsibility as well. It just doesn't. We have to be very careful.
We're nearly out of time here, so I'm just going to go through each of you and ask for, in a few words, just a couple of take-home messages each that you would like to provide, that may provide advice or help to those individuals who are still under duress from this pandemic. So Marissa, would you start, please?
Yeah, so I think one key take-home message was to be kind to yourself and to be kind to others during this very difficult time. And to me, being kind to myself means taking time outside of work to really take care of my body and my mind, and also to connect with my family and friends. So having a better work-life balance. And that can be something really small. You're journaling every day and you're just saying what you're grateful for. And that brings a little bit of joy to your life. It doesn't have to be this huge initiative. You're going to run for an hour every day, but maybe you're going to stand up between meetings and just walk around and get a little bit more movement in your day. And I think being kind to others, we never know what someone else is going through in their lives. And so just having a bit more patience during this time, I think is really important and can go a long way. And I also think another key lesson was just to find meaning in whatever it is you're doing. So I think we're really lucky in the field that we're in, where we can make a big impact in the world for greater good. And so really hold on to why are you in this field? What are you trying to accomplish? And how do you find meaning in it? And by doing that, you can help yourself get through some of those really hard challenges and struggles by keeping focused on what is the meaning behind what you're doing.
Fantastic, thank you. Zach?
I think we've heard over and over, it's really important to commit to connecting, and that's not just from a research standpoint, but taking care of each other. If you haven't heard from someone, reach out to them, set up a time, try to set up a time not to talk about science, but maybe mentorship or life. It's not easy to go for coffee, but you still have to be available and try to be there for people. I think the technology that we're using is incredibly enabling, but it also is quite invasive. It has enabled multitasking, which sometimes is a bad thing. I think I mentioned to the group yesterday that, I've been on the playground with AirPods on Zoom meetings thinking this is probably not good parenting or good science right now. And, back-to-back Zoom meetings, you never have to get up and walk to your next meeting. So they're literally stacked on top of each other. So try to schedule yourself for 5 or 10 minutes to breathe in between. And I think the last thing is that role modeling has really changed. And I think technology is another good example of how role modeling has changed. Usually people can watch you interact with other people, and that's not available anymore. So try to leave your Slack groups, your Zoom meetings, try to be very inclusive, because people like to read along. They like to see the communication, even if they're not directly participating. I think they can learn from that role modeling as a student and as a supervisor.
Kristen.
I mean, such great points already mentioned. I'll just add that, giving yourself a break. I think that's been my one big lesson this year. And Marissa's touched on this. I think, get yourself a really good book of fiction, get your brain out of your problems for a while. That can be enormously restorative. Going for walks, just give yourself that space and that break. It's interesting too what Zach was saying about the Zoom meetings all lined up. And I've heard people say this is a pro, this is more efficiency. And I disagree. I think that, you do need that time in your day, that break, that chance to reset a little bit. So make sure to take that time and consciously plan it into your day. And we've already all touched on this, but this idea of reaching out and asking for help, not just, that's been most of my conversations when I do reach out is, I'm experiencing this, and it's amazing how the positive responses that I've gotten back. So, and just as Marissa has already said, if anyone has any questions or wants to talk to a PI or a woman in science or a mom, please reach out. I'm super happy to help in any way that I can.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you. Jim.
Some good, very good comments. I mean, I think what would my part, sort of leaving comment would be, I think there's a lot of FOMO going around, right? The fear of missing out. That you look back at the past year and think, oh my goodness, I've not been able to achieve anything. I'm behind everybody else, and the fact is that everybody else is behind too. So you don't look upon that can inspire despair and a feeling of helplessness. I think everybody has experienced this, yes, to different degrees, but I think the more compassion and empathy we have for others, and understanding that it works both ways, that there are others worse off than you and better off than you, and we should be trying to exchange those experiences and trying to help everybody recover as soon as possible, because the sooner we do recover, the better for everybody, including society. So everybody's experience is different, but everybody's experiencing differences, and I think we only find that out by talking to each other.
We're all looking forward to the Roaring 20s, hopefully. So with that, I'm going to thank our speakers and our audience. And before everyone turns off and moves on to other things, this conversation will be made available on YouTube. I'll upload it onto the channel ASAP. And I'll just quickly share with you some upcoming events that I think will be useful for our research community. So we have a mental health webinar, which we're co-hosting with BioCanRx. That's coming up April 21st. Excuse me. We have a cryopreservation in regenerative medicine workshop. This is a two-day event, which is spread across two months, and it deals with some basic concepts and fundamentals of cryopreservation, because I know everyone uses it, but not everyone knows really the background to it. And so this is really important for good translational. We have an RNA-seq workshop. Zach mentioned the importance of being able to do analysis in silico, and this is one opportunity to develop your skills here. This is very popular. And finally, we also have upcoming as well The next episode of Training for Success in Canada's Regenerative Medicine Sector, this was a very, very popular and very well received event in which we provide trainees with access to courses on GMP, GLP, GCP, and quality assurance, etc. And then they get a career session with a number of industry experts. So those are all really good opportunities for people to consider. And with that, I would also like to mention that you can connect with these events on our website. And also we have a Twitter account at Stem Cell Network and an Instagram account, which is at SCN Canada. So with that, thank you very much to everyone.